This amendment of the Criminal Code will help protect Canada's war memorials and cenotaphs from vandalism, defilement, and damage. Those who have fought and died in our great country deserve to know that the 41st Parliament is working to protect the monuments and memorials erected in their honour. I'm pleased to rise on behalf of my constituents of Dufferin-Caledon to open the debate on my private member's bill, an act to amend the Criminal Code, which is mischief related to war memorials. The bill seeks to add significant penalties for anyone convicted of mischief against a war memorial, cenotaph, or other structure honoring or remembering those who have served in our armed forces and those who have died as a consequence of war. I think the timing of this debate, Mr. Speaker, is particularly significant, given that we pause to honour our fallen and our veterans next week on Remembrance Day. Vandalism and defacement of a war memorial should not be tolerated in our great country. It is the duty of every Canadian citizen to respect those who have sacrificed their lives for our country. For those who do not share this same reverent respect for members of our armed forces, there must be punishment. Bill C-217 will amend the Criminal Code to make a conviction punishable by a fine of not less than $1,000 on a first offence, imprisonment of not less than 14 days on a second offence, and imprisonment of not less than 30 days on subsequent offences. Unfortunately, I feel these increased measures are necessary due to the increased amount of mischief against Canada's cenotaphs and monuments. In November 2008, in my own constituency of Dufferin-Caledon, a cenotaph was desecrated within a week of its rededication. The town of Orangeville, the community where the cenotaph is located, spent nearly $2,000 repairing the newly restored monument just days before the annual Remembrance Day services. Regrettably, this isn't the only case of mischief against cenotaphs and monuments. This type of vandalism occurs all over the country, and Mr. Speaker, it is for the 41st Parliament to take action. Mr. Speaker, it is most concerning that in the past few years there have been numerous incidents of war memorial vandalism across the country. It is time to take a stand against this desecration of our sacred memorials and punish those responsible for this type of destruction. Bill C-217 would place stiffer penalties on the vandalism of war memorials and hopefully force potential vandals to seriously reconsider defacing these important Canadian symbols of pride and honour. By allowing the Criminal Code to remain unchanged, we are doing a disservice to all those who have served in our wars and to all those who have sacrificed their lives so that our great country may remain free. The desecration of our war memorials must not continue. Vandals must face a harsher punishment to ensure that they will think twice before committing this type of violation. Some examples, Mr. Speaker. In Kirkland Lake, a teenager was charged with urinating on the memorial wall, but was able to attend a diversion program to allow the mischief charge to be dropped. In Ottawa, our nation's capital, a man was found urinating on the National War Memorial on Canada Day. The charge was withdrawn after the culprit issued a written apology to Canadian veterans, completed community service, and donated a mere $200 to charity. After this unacceptable conduct, this criminal did not even have a mischief charge against him. Mr. Speaker, this is simply unacceptable. It is obvious that these vandals do not think about what they are doing and haven't thought about the blatant disrespect they've displayed for these memorials. We must give them something to think about. Significant fines and weeks of imprisonment will complete this objective in a way that simple apology letters and deferment programs do not. Canadian citizens should be proud of their history and remain proud of the monuments honouring those who have given their lives so that we may remain free and not fearful that their monuments will be desecrated by thoughtless individuals. In Toronto, vandals hooked up a chain to a concrete cross and using an all-terrain vehicle pulled it from its perch on a cenotaph. This was the second time the cross had been stolen in less than a year. A very disturbing story, someone in Beamsville broke into the conical mausoleum and emptied an urn of ashes onto the ground. Though these 3 people are buried in the mausoleum, it's likely that the ashes belonged to a War of 1812 veteran. In Waterloo, police arrested 3 young people ranging in age from 12 to 18 who were responsible for toppling between 300 and 400 graves, many of which were graves of war veterans. Mr. Speaker, you have heard multiple cases in which our cherished war memorials and cenotaphs have been vandalized and disrespected. We must discourage such behavior. Explicit punishments must be written into the criminal code for mischievous conduct to address these atrocious crimes. We have a duty, Mr. Speaker, to protect the memories of those who have sacrificed their lives so that we may continue to live freely in our great country. These memorials and what they represent command our utmost respect and efforts to preserve and protect them. Canadian citizens also deserve to know that conduct such as this will not be tolerated in any way. In a most disturbing case, Mr. Speaker, on the morning of this past September 25th, a Canadian Forces veteran who has served in Afghanistan discovered freshly sprayed paint graffiti tags on the monument at the Gerard Park on Sherbrooke Street in Montreal's Notre-Dame-de-Grâce neighbourhood. This was the second time in less than 18 months this beautiful monument had been defaced. What a slap in the face for that Canadian Forces member to have been the one to discover such disrespect. Mr. Speaker, city workers later had to remove the offending graffiti at a cost of several $1,000s. Our country's bravest deserve much better. They have fought and died for our country and therefore deserve our utmost respect. We have an obligation to protect and preserve their dignity. Canadians as a whole deserve to know that we take our war memorials seriously and that we understand the significance they embody. It is time for this Parliament to take a stand against mischief relating to war memorials. The use of fines and imprisonment will convey this message to those who appear to have no respect for our armed forces, veterans, and those who have made the ultimate sacrifice. Anyone who willfully damages or desecrates a war memorial should face stiff consequences. Mr. Speaker, we owe it to our men and women in uniform to protect these revered memorials. The 200th anniversary of the War of 1812 will be upon us next year. As Canadians, we are extremely proud of the role that our great country played, and we will soon be celebrating this important anniversary. Often at the foot of our war memorials and cenotaphs, we must ensure that these memorials will still be beautiful for our ceremonies, rather than desecrated by vandals on the eve of the services. Following the anniversary for the War of 1812, the 100th anniversary of World War I will occur. Canada played an immense role in this war, and this anniversary will be a time to remember all those who died defending our country and democracy. Numerous memorials throughout the country have been erected to honour those who fought in World War I. Our Parliament must help to ensure that these memorials remain untouched by vandalism. Now, with these important events around the corner, this is an opportune time to pass this legislation to protect and preserve those symbols to the best of our ability, and this bill will do just that. We all know someone, Mr. Speaker, who has fought for our great country. A father, a grandfather, a son, a daughter, a husband, a wife, a friend. We appreciate that these men and women for the desecration that they've shown to our country and for their willingness to fight abroad for our freedom here at home. Memorials in our communities are dedicated to those people, and none of us should want to see them damaged or defiled. Harsher penalties will keep this from happening. They will make potential vandals think twice before acting against a memorial which so many of us consider sacred. Mr. Speaker, as all members know, this past summer the Canadian Forces wound down combat operations in Afghanistan. This was Canada's longest ever combat mission, a mission in which our country lost 157 brave men and women of the Canadian Forces. As a result, I think our memorials and cenotaphs have a renewed sense of purpose and value, especially in those communities which lost one of their own. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, that conflict continues, and only this past weekend, Canada lost another brave soldier to a suicide attack on a NATO convoy in Kabul. We owe such to our so much to our men and women in uniform, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, it is widely agreed that Canada came of age on a nation of the muddy battlefields of France during the First World War. Our participation in this great conflict was out of proportion to our population, and we overcame challenges that had defeated other nations. Our mettle was tested to enormous cost of life, and many of our brave soldiers sacrificed everything in the defense of freedom. The call came again in the Second World War, when once again tens of thousands of brave young Canadians went to the aid of our allies in the cause of freedom. That conflict reshaped our world, and Canada played no small part in its outcome. From the Battle of the Atlantic to Juno Beach, from Italy to Hong Kong, Canadians were at the forefront in that conflict. In Korea, and on to the birth of UN peacekeeping with the Suez Crisis, Canadian forces continued to place their lives on the line for freedom and democracy. Through dozens of peacekeeping missions and during the long years of the Cold War, our young men and women in uniform have always been ready and willing to put country before self. In the first Gulf War, and in the Balkans, and then Afghanistan, and now Libya, Mr. Speaker, the best of our young men and women have shown time and time again their willingness to defend Canada and her values. All too often, that willingness has cost them their lives. To honor the memory of these young men and women, Mr. Speaker, our communities erect memorials and cenotaphs, and rightly so. We create honored spaces in our cities, towns, and villages where we can gather to remember them. Whether it's on Remembrance Day or any other day of the year, we might choose to pause and reflect. These spaces and those memorials signify the cost of our democracy, freedom, and way of life. Those of us who enjoy the hard-won freedoms that are part of modern Canada owe it to those who have paid in blood and life to keep those honored spaces free from harm or insult. We have a solemn duty as citizens and residents of this wonderful country to protect and preserve our memorials and cenotaphs in the memory of those who have fallen. When vandalism occurred in one of these honored places, we are all diminished. An act of such disrespect is offensive, not only to our local veterans, but it is offensive to all those who care about those veterans and everyone who cares about the sacrifices they have made. Mr. Speaker, Bill 217 delivers a clear message. The vandalism and desecration of any Canadian cenotaph or war memorial will not be tolerated. We are compelled to protect these revered places. We owe it all to the Canadian men and women who have fought in our armed forces. Mr. Speaker, in consultation with the Minister of Justice, I propose a move an amendment at committee should C-217 carry in second reading, and that would increase the minimum penalty under indictment from my proposed 5 years to 10 years. This is a technical amendment which would simply ensure that this new offence is consistent with the current similar criminal code offence of Section 431A, which criminalizes the willful destruction of damaged property. Without this amendment, we would be creating inconsistencies within the existing legislative framework. Mr. Speaker, I urge all of my colleagues to consider the adoption of Bill C-217. The desecration of war memorials is something that can happen in any community at any time. We all owe it to the constituents of our ridings, especially to the veterans of our respective ridings, to support the passage of this bill. This amendment of the Criminal Code will help protect Canada's war memorials and cenotaphs from vandalism, defilement, and damage. Those who have fought and died in our great country deserve to know that the 41st Parliament is working to protect the monuments and memorials erected in their honour. Mr. Speaker, as I said at the outset, all colleagues in this House will join millions of Canadians next week on Remembrance Day as we honour those who have paid the ultimate sacrifice to keep Canada, the true North, strong and free. Our long and proud tradition of standing up to defend freedom and democracy and to defend our values is one of the things that makes Canada the greatest country in the world today. We are a free, open and democratic society that prides itself on the rule of law. Those who would disrespect our honoured community spaces that are dedicated to the remembrance of the fallen through vandalism or other such acts must be held to account under the law. The debt we owe our veterans and the fallen soldiers require that we look upon any disrespect to our cenotaphs and war memorials as a deeply grave matter and very serious consequence. Mr. Speaker, I believe that the passage of 217 is necessary in ensuring that those who would damage our honoured places think twice before they act to desecrate our war memorials and cenotaphs. I encourage all of my colleagues in the House to join me in taking decisive action on this important issue. Thank you very much.
From my own point of view, you can see me wearing a poppy like many of our colleagues are wearing poppies and showing respect for our veterans, and we will all be, as the member said, attending services next week in our communities where respect for our veterans and their contribution is being acknowledged. And we'll all be there because we all, collectively, I think every single person in this House has a great deal of respect for the veterans, for our serving soldiers. I think there probably hasn't been a time, not in my lifetime, certainly, and I was born before Confederation, Mr. Speaker. There hasn't been a time I was born in a place which wasn't part of Canada when I was born. And that there hasn't been a time in my lifetime where there hasn't been the kind of respect for serving soldiers and veterans as there is today. And you see it in, members will know that in recent years, last 10 years, 15 years, there has been more and more public attendance at war memorials and showing their respect and interest and concern for veterans and the contribution that they make and serving soldiers make. So this is the context in which the member brings forth this legislation, and I respect his views in bringing that forward. But I want to talk about the context a little bit more, because the one thing that as the Speaker said was very important, that we want young people or anybody to think twice before they do this sort of thing. I guess as my colleague from Sackville Eastern Shore, who's the veterans critic for our party and as tireless, if I may use that term, advocate for veterans ever since he's been in this House, as he pointed out, I don't think many people even think once before they do something, as the member was talking about, either showing disrespect or, in some cases, actually defacing a war memorial. But he also said that this amendment is necessary in order to avoid inconsistencies in the law, and reflecting on that, I'd like to comment on the section that we're talking about, which is section 430 of the Criminal Code, which is the mischief section. And mischief is defined in section 430 as anyone who willfully, that has to be willfully, destroys or damages property, renders property dangerous, useless, inoperative, or ineffective, obstructs, interrupts, or interferes with the lawful use, enjoyment, or operation of property, or obstructs, interrupts, or interferes with any person in the lawful use or operation of property. So it's a very broad definition of what mischief is. And I do want to say that there's other aspects to it, but the punishment for mischief, if that mischief causes actual danger to life, a person is guilty of an indictable offence and is liable to imprisonment for life. So if someone commits mischief that actually endangers life, the maximum penalty is life imprisonment. In terms of other types of property, there's also, again, to talk about consistency or inconsistency. If the property, for example, is of a certain type, there are the general penalty for mischief is an indictable. The person is guilty of an indictable offence and liable to an imprisonment for a term not exceeding 2 years. So the penalty for mischief is 2 years imprisonment. That's the maximum penalty. 2 years imprisonment for mischief. So in a proper case, the judge can actually put somebody in jail for 2 years for committing mischief. If the offence is preceded by summary conviction, which is another way of proceeding, the person can be guilty of an offence punishable on summary conviction, and the penalty for that, Mr. Speaker, is $5,000 fine or 6 months in jail. So depending on whether it's preceded by indictment or preceded by summary conviction, the fine can be as much as $5,000, 6 months in jail, or 2 years in jail. Now, The criminal code also deals with other types of property. So if mischief in relation to certain other types of property, the penalties are increased. Now, what the member wants to do here is say, okay, this is a special type of property, sacred to our veterans and sacred to all of us, because of the nature of the property is designed to honor those who died in the service of their country, and therefore there should be a greater penalty, and a greater penalty than ordinary mischief. So 2 years maximum is not enough. Summary conviction, 5,000 fine, or 6 months is not enough. And here's how the criminal code deals with other types of property, and one of them is what they call testamentary instruments, so a will. So if you destroy a will, someone's last will and testament, trying to leave their property to the person and people that they want to. So the punishment for someone who does that is a maximum of 10 years. So it goes from 2 to 10 for maximum penalty for destruction of a testamentary instrument if you proceed by indictment. So that's how they deal with it. There's another type of property here, and it seems to me, and I know that the member might be able to enlighten us, but if I were, it seems to me that the legislative draftsperson, whoever drafted this bill, or the legislative council, probably looked at this section to draft that one. It says mischief in relation to religious property. Everyone who commits mischief in relation to property is a building, structure, or part thereof primarily used for religious worship, including a church, mosque, synagogue, temple, or an object associated with religious worship. Now, nothing could be more sacred than that, or associated with a part of a structure, is if the commission of the mischief is motivated by bias, prejudice, or hate based on religion, race, color, or national or ethnic origin, is guilty of an indictable offence and liable to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 10 years, or is guilty of an offence punishable in summary conviction and liable to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 18 months. So summary conviction 18 months instead of 6, indictable 10 instead of 2. But, and the but here is not just defacing a church or destroying a church or urinating on church grounds or in a cemetery or whatever. It has to be based on, the motivation has to be bias, prejudice, hate based on religion, race, color. So it has to be a hate crime or a prejudice, again, based on religion, race, color, national or ethnic origin. So in other words, if you put a swastika, Mr. Speaker, if you put a swastika on a synagogue with a spray paint, you're defacing a church, and if that's done based on bias, prejudice, hate, based on religion, race, color, then the offence is considered extremely serious, and you're liable to a punishment for a term not exceeding 10 years, or if by summary conviction, then it's by 18 months, for maximum 18 months. Now, in either of any of those cases, testamentary instrument or otherwise, is there a specified fine or imprisonment or term? But the maximums are increased. In the case of a testamentary instrument by five times, so 10 years, and in the case of a synagogue or a church or a mosque or other religious site, up to 10 years or 18 months for a summary conviction, if there's proof of hatred or bias or prejudice. So that's the way the criminal code deals with matters that our society considers, let's say, more sacred than ordinary property. Ordinary property, mischief against property. If I scratch your car with a key walking past your car just for vandalism, that's mischief in relation to property. Maximum sentence 2 years, or by indictment 5,000 fine or 6 months in jail. But if I deface a church, or if I destroy a will, if I deface a church or a synagogue with prejudice, then the things are up. Now, what the member is proposing here is something a little different. If we want consistency, we might have to do something a little different than that. But I understand the concern that the member has raised, and we share the concern. If there's if this is something so widespread by people who are willfully doing this, then we'll certainly have to think about whether or not this is the appropriate way to deal with it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise in support in principle of Bill C-217, which is an act to amend the criminal code, particularly with respect to mischief relating to war memorials, which was introduced by the member for Dufferin-Caledon on June 15, 2011. The bill effectively creates a new crime where a person commits mischief in relation to war memorials and similar monuments honoring those who died during a war by introducing a new paragraph to Section 430 of the Criminal Code. As a member for Dufferin-Caledon put it, this debate takes place at an appropriate moment of remembrance. It takes place on the eve of our commemoration of Remembrance Day, where we remember those who are no longer with us, where we remember those who, as the member for Sackville Eastern Shore put it in this House, those who gave the greatest gift of all, the gift of life, so that we may live and so that we may enjoy our liberty. And where we pay tribute to the veterans amongst us and their families who reflect and represent the sacrifice of those who are no longer with us, and we honor them, and where we pay tribute to our men and women in uniform across this world who are protecting our fundamental rights, who are safeguarding our democracy, who are protecting our human security, who are indeed protecting our international peace and security. And in effect, Mr. Speaker, in 2005, when I was Minister of Justice and Attorney General, I at that point developed a national justice initiative with respect to combating hatred and racism, which spoke with respect to the danger of this kind of assault on our war memorials, of those kinds of hate crimes that end up being an assault on the dignity, inherent dignity of every human being, and an assault on our equal dignity and indeed on our character as a multicultural society. And so, Mr. Speaker, Section 430 of the Code currently outlines the definition of mischief and associated penalties. The section also includes specific provisions for mischief relating to data and religious and cultural property and their associated penalties. Bill C-217 would add another specific provision, this one for mischief, as I said, related to war memorials. And it also outlines possible sentences for a person convicted of such a crime and would create as well mandatory minimum sentences. Mr. Speaker, it's important to recall that the member for Ottawa South at the time in 2006 first proposed then that the newly elected Conservative government pass a law to make damage done to war memorials a specific offence. This push to protect monuments came in the wake of an incident on Canada Day in 2006, which we recall, in which a man and two youths were observed urinating on Canada's National War Memorial in Ottawa. The man involved in the incident has since had his mischief charge dropped after partaking in voluntary community service. I mention this, Mr. Speaker, because it would seem to me that the appropriate response with respect to that kind of vandalism is not to institute a mandatory minimum, but to respond by way of community work, by way of education, by way of them having to meet with the veterans and confront exactly the nature of the outrage that they committed, and thereby, in learning from that would be a more appropriate remedy than introducing a mandatory minimum. Since the member for Ottawa South introduced his proposal, there were other incidents involving monument vandalism, including an incident of a cross being torn from a cenotaph at a Royal Canadian Legion in Belle Irwin. At the time, in 2006, the then Justice Minister was not yet prepared to accept the proposal of the member of Ottawa South, and that leads us to where we are today, and to a related initiative, Mr. Speaker, that with the recent passing of Bill C-442, an act to establish a national Holocaust monument, a monument which is intended for us to recall and remember horrors too terrible to be believed, but not too terrible to have happened. The importance, therefore, of protecting war memorials of the dignity of the individuals they represent, and the values of freedom, democracy, and human rights are omnipresent in this regard. And so I support the need for an initiative to have a specific law protective of war memorials, to express the condemnation of society of those who deface those monuments and memorials that are dedicated to our veterans, to our soldiers, to the victims of mass atrocity, both domestic and international. But I caution as to the use of a mandatory minimum with respect to a remedial approach regarding this offence. Mr. Speaker, may I conclude by saying that, as I mentioned, that I support the bill in principle. I trust that the member for Dufferin-Caledon may perhaps be open to amending the bill with respect to removing the mandatory minimums, and whereby we proceed in terms of alternative forms of punishment. And I trust that the further discussion of the bill can lead us in the direction of where we can support the principle, certainly, which is very compelling, and I commend the member for introducing this private member's bill, but we tailor the remedy with respect to the offence to the individual, and do so in a manner that we can achieve an outcome that may be more appropriate in that regard, while still achieving the objective which we seek. And again, may I close by saying it is an appropriate initiative on the eve of Remembrance Day. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.